I think we're going to get non-invasive continuous glucose monitoring in 2023 or 2024 at the latest. And I'm very excited about that. I'm looking forward to sharing that excitement with you. So what I've done is that I've conducted an analysis of what's happening in the sector and all the companies that are involved in it. And that's what this video is about. We're going to talk about the companies, we're going to talk about the technologies that they use, and where they're at. So hi, welcome back to the channel. So continuous non-invasive glucose monitoring is obviously going to be a big deal for people with diabetes, but I quite frankly think it's an even bigger game changer for those of us who are healthy. And the reason for that is that, blood sugar spikes are quite frankly bad for everybody, but those of us who are healthy, who don't have diabetes, who therefore didn't need to measure our blood sugar, probably are not very well attuned to which foods make our blood sugar spike and which ones don't. And so being able to do that in a non-invasive manner, I think, is going to be really useful and make a significant difference to most of us. And so I'm certainly very excited about that in that regard. And I'm obviously also very excited for people who have diabetes, who've had to prick their fingers and whatnot, which is obviously not a pleasant thing to have to do. So it will clearly be huge for them as well. Now, I've divided this video into 5 different sections, and I will have the title and the timelines to sort of save your time and allow you to navigate where you want to go. And the sections are, first section, we're going to talk about what blood sugar spikes are bad, and the interesting research about how differentiated our metabolisms are. Second, we're going to talk about the 3 different types of technologies that the 10 companies that we're going to look at use. Next, we're going to look at the 10 different companies. Then we're going to talk about my thoughts about incorporating continuous glucose monitors into smartwatches as opposed to having them as freestanding wearable devices. And finally, we're going to wrap it up with a summary. So with that, let's get into it. So why is glucose in the blood and recurring blood sugar spikes bad for us? Well, glucose makes blood syrupy. And syrupy blood is harder for the heart to pump. And in the long term, it's going to make the heart less healthy and quite frankly sick. In addition, high levels of blood glucose also impact our kidneys and our eyes in a negative way. And they could also negatively impact the nerve endings in our toes and our fingers called neuropathy. All of which are obviously things that we should try to avoid. But unfortunately, it's hard to do that without knowing which foods are going to spike our blood glucose, which is obviously hard to do given that our metabolisms are very, very individualized. There was a very interesting study done that was published in the journal Cell, which is a very high-powered journal, and I will link to it in the description below so you can take a look at it. But what they did is that they had 800 people participate in this study. They gave them certain specific foods to eat, and they measured their blood sugar directly after the meals and for some time thereafter. And the one conclusion that stands out from that study, and I will quote it, is that people eating identical meals present high variability in post-meal blood glucose response, which once again means you and I could be eating the same foods in the same quantities, but our blood sugar will respond to those foods very differently. It may spike for one of us, but not for the other. And you cannot use something like the food pyramid or anything like that to decide that, because our responses are so different. It could be different to chocolate chip cookies and different to fruits, quite frankly. And so for that reason, the only way for us to know which foods are good for us at least from a blood sugar perspective or not, is to measure our blood sugar after we've eaten those foods. And so to be healthier, we actually need to have some understanding of how foods impact our blood sugar. And hopefully, non-invasive continuous glucose monitoring will make it easier for all of us. So in this section, we're going to take a look at the technologies that the leading potential developers of non-invasive continuous glucose monitoring solutions are using. And as you'll see, those are very cool, very interesting technologies, very, very advanced. And what gives me confidence that at least one of these companies will be successful in 23 or 24 is the wide range of different technologies that they use. And so I've divided them for simplicity's sake into 3 different categories. They are radio frequency, laser, and what we'll call Biosensor. And so two of these technologies, the radio frequency and the laser, send signals underneath the skin to measure the level of glucose in the ISF, the interstitial fluid. And the third one actually pulls the ISF from underneath the skin onto the skin surface and measures it there with what we call biosensors. And we're going to look at it in more detail as we sort of look at the specific companies and how and what they're doing. Because we're dealing with very small changes in either light or temperature and minute quantities of the ISF, the analytics become very, very important here. Now, it requires some very sophisticated statistical analysis, which these days we're of course going to call AI, because AI is the thing to do. So before we continue and look at the different companies, let's talk about a couple of different terms. The first term that you're going to hear is MARD, which stands for mean absolute relative difference and is expressed in percentage terms. And the MARD is the difference between two different testing matters. In other words, how well the CGM values compare to a reference value from some other device. And obviously we're going to get as close as possible, and 10% is sort of the benchmark here. The other term that you're going to hear is the ISF, which stands for the interstitial fluid, which is what many of the continuous glucose monitoring devices actually measure glucose in, because it's closer to the skin surface and easier to access than blood itself. And with that, we're going to start looking at the companies, and we're going to start with the radio frequency companies. And just to get a little technical, the way to think about it is that as blood glucose levels rise, the permittivity, yes, permittivity, which is a word you may never have heard of before, but think of it as the permeability of the blood to microelectrical signals declines, and as a result of that, the resonant frequencies rise, and that is what enables us to use radio frequencies to detect the levels of glucose in the blood and the ISF. So if it all sounds Greek to you, don't worry about it. Just understand that these three companies are sending radio frequencies into our skin, and based on the responses, they can understand the level of blood glucose. And we're going to look at four companies. They're called Hagar, No Labs, GlucoRx, and Movana. And so Hagar is an Israeli company. They raised $11.7 million in 2021. They have obtained a breakthrough designation from the FDA, which is a big deal and is going to help them a great deal. They completed a 5-person study back in 2020. And their next step is a 250-person clinical trial of type 1 and type 2 diabetics. So if things go well, they could be ready to bring their device to market in 23 or 24. Let's watch and see, and fingers crossed. Next is No Labs, which is a Seattle-based company. They're relatively small, but they've actually been public since 2019. They raised $8 million in September of 2022, so very recently. The results of their internal trials in 2021 look very encouraging. They achieved an MARD, there's that term again, of 5 to 7%, which is excellent. They have not yet got a breakthrough designation from the FDA, and they are not yet ready to start clinical trials, so they're a little further back. The third company is GlucoRx. They're a UK company. Their device is actually a small disc. It weighs about 14 grams. It has 42 millimeters in diameter, and it's 7 millimeters thick. They have conducted as many as 5 different clinical trials with the University of Cardiff in the UK using their sensors. Their largest study was a 50-person study. Comprised of non-diabetics as well as type 1 and type 2 diabetics. They achieved an MARD for their biosensor with an X of 10.4%, which is excellent. They expect to obtain their European CE certification and launch a product in Europe in 2023 and in the US thereafter. And they may very well be one of the two companies that is the furthest along here. The fourth company is called Movano. They're a California-based company. They're listed on the NASDAQ. They have developed a tiny radio frequency chip. They completed a 10-person feasibility study in 2022. We don't know what the result of that was. And next, they're looking to conduct a 100-person trial. So all the best to them. And that completes the radio frequency companies. And so the next group of companies that we're going to talk about are companies that use lasers to measure blood glucose. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the technology, because it's actually very cool and very interesting. So it turns out there are three things that happen when we shine lasers onto our skin. The first one, obviously, is that we can measure how much light we send in versus how much comes back, and therefore understand how much of it was absorbed by the glucose in the blood. Second, as we shine lasers onto our skin, it heats up the skin and the ISF a tiny little bit, but enough for us to be able to measure it. And once again, by being able to understand the temperature changes, we can correlate them to the concentration of glucose in the blood and measure blood glucose in effect. And thirdly, as we shine lasers onto molecules, skin and liquid fluids included, it causes the molecules to rotate and oscillate. And as a result of that, the returning light is scattered. And by measuring the scattering of that light, we can understand the concentration of whatever it is that we're looking to measure, in this case, glucose. And this is called Raman spectroscopy. And so this is all very cool and very useful. And we're going to talk about the specific techniques here that the different companies are using as we talk about the companies in a second. Now, one more thing in terms of lasers as opposed to LED lights, which is what most smartwatches and that like currently use. And the reason for using lasers rather than LED lights is that lasers can be much more focused, much more precise, and much more specific in terms of their wavelengths. So that's obviously very useful. Second, lasers can be used over a much wider range of wavelengths than LEDs. And so that once again enables us to measure a larger number of different things. And finally, lasers can reach much deeper underneath the skin than LED lights. And so lots of good reasons to be using lasers rather than LED lights. They just give us more control and much more precision. So with that, the three companies that we're going to look at are Rockley Photonics, Diamond Tech, and RSP Systems. And Rockley Photonics is a New York Stock Exchange listed company. They're a supplier to Apple. They have a new collaboration agreement with Medtronic, which is a major medical device company, which is also very active in the glucose monitoring field. They claim to have developed an integrated circuit or a chip with multiple laser lines, which allows them to measure a variety of different metabolites, glucose being one of them, alcohol being yet another one, as well as lactate. And so what they've done is so far they've announced the VitaChip Pro, which is a non-invasive measurement of alcohol, glucose, and lactate. And it's apparently being tested by one of the wearables manufacturers. And their plan is to release a non-invasive continuous glucose monitoring chip, or actually device, in the second half of 2023 for the consumer market, so that will not be approved. And then in the second half of 2024, they expect to be able to release one that has been FDA approved. So certainly look forward to that. Diamond Tech is a German company, which, as you can tell, is very, very proud of German workmanship, and why not? And they have raised $5 million in 2022, so they're well underway in terms of their fundraising, I guess. And they are initially developing a glucose measuring device that is relatively small, but not a wearable. And their approach is to measure the heat generated when they shine a laser onto a finger. They have conducted a 100-person study in 2022 and achieved an MARD of 10.1%. So far, they seem to be able to achieve very good accuracy from their device. The third company is RSP Systems. It's a Danish company. They raised 5 million euros in 2022. They've raised 32 million euros since 2020. And they are using Raman spectroscopy, which we talked about a minute ago, which measures the fragmentation of light. So they send a laser into the skin, and then their device GlucoBeam is measuring how fragmented the light that is returned is. They have conducted clinical trials with GlucoBeam with some 700 patients to date. We don't know what their MARD is, so we'll have to see how that pans out. So the third set of companies is what we call biosensor companies, and what they all do is that they use different methods to pull the ISF, which you will recall is underneath the skin, to the skin surface and then measure it on the skin surface with a biosensor. So the three companies are Glycemic, PK Vitality, and Graphware. Glycemic is a Finnish company. They use something called magnetohydrodynamic technology, which uses magnetic forces to extract the ISF and bring it to the surface of the skin where it can be measured. In their 2022 trials, they achieved an MARD of 12.9% in 5 healthy volunteers, and they've since then apparently improved it to 9%. And they use an enzymatic assay to measure blood glucose once in the ISF once they pull the ISF up. Their clinical trials plans have been blessed by the Finnish equivalent of the FDA, so my understanding is that they will not be conducting clinical trials with volunteers. PK Vitality is a French firm. They raised 6 million euros in 2022. They too bring the ISF to the surface and then they measure it with a biodisposable sensor. They completed human trials in 22, achieved a 16% MARD. It needs to be improved a little bit, and hopefully they'll be able to do that. Their expectation is that they'll be able to bring a product to market in 2024. And finally, we have a company called Graphware. They're based in San Francisco, California. They recently, in 2021, raised $20.5 million. They use electric fields to pull the ISF through the skin onto the surface, and then they use, interestingly enough, a graphene-based sensor. Graphene is a very interesting material, which is very suited for this purpose, to analyze the content of the ISF to see how much glucose it contains. They completed a 40-person feasibility study. We don't know what the MARD was, so we'll just have to see. And that concludes the review of our 10 companies. And so I know that we would ideally like to have those non-invasive continuous glucose monitors incorporated into smartwatches, but I'm not sure that's where we're going to start. And so when I think about what we're going to have hopefully in 2023 or 2024, it's not going to be smartwatch-based continuous glucose monitors. It's probably going to be freestanding ones, a number of which will have sort of a watch form factor. And the reason for that is that incorporating continuous glucose monitors into smartwatches presents a couple of challenges. The first one is there is a limited amount of real estate on a smartwatch. And so is there really room for another set of sensors? And the other one, of course, is battery power. Now, there might be a way of getting around that. And I think in particular, for instance, someone like Rockley Photonics, I think is betting on the Apples and maybe other wearable companies replacing their current LED-based chips for measuring heart rate and other things like this with a Rockley chip which will measure everything, heart rate, hopefully lactate, glucose, maybe even other things. And that will, of course, take care of both the real estate problem and quite possibly the battery problem. In principle, lasers should be more efficient than LEDs because they can be more targeted, more focused, but we'll obviously have to see how it plays out on smartwatches. So that brings us to the end. Hopefully you've seen that there are many interesting efforts going on. Some of them are relatively close, which is why I'm hopeful that we'll have at least some freestanding non-invasive continuous glucose monitors in 2023, 2024. This is a summary that you can look at here, and fingers crossed. I hope you found this video useful, interesting, enjoyable, and be well.